Merci beaucoup, Mathias. Je veux remercier toi encore une fois publiquement et dire que ceci a été une splendide occasion pour discuter sur ma recherche. Et je remercie toutes vous en avance pour être ici et je vais parler en anglais. So thank you very much indeed for being there, being here, and this is the last of our lectures on this proposal of a kind of pragmatist anthropology. And with this very last lecture, we are coming to the last issue I try to explore in my book. That is the issue I called Enlanguaged Experience. And as you can see from the very subtitle of today's lecture, my idea is that this is a means for going beyond the dualism, the opposition between sensibility and language, and recovering a kind of continuity. Of course, the point will be also understanding which kind of continuity are we going to consider, because continuity can be understood in many different ways. So very shortly, as usual, I'm going to present you the general plan of the talk. It's simple, and it will be even more simple because I will skip the third point. So basically, I will introduce you to the general idea of Enlanguaged Experience as a kind of conceptual means for overcoming the opposition. And in a second part, or in a second section of the talk, I will try to focus on some of the contribution that can be derived, that I have tried to derive from John Dewey, William James, George Herbert Mead, and also an almost neglected figure, this Frank Lorimer, that I fortuitously discovered in the Morris Library in Southern Illinois Library at Carbondale. That to me represents a very interesting development of some of Dewey's ideas on language and experience. I will just hint at the end of the lecture on some possible interesting convergences with a current debate in an activism, particularly, and more generally in the field of post-cognitive cognitive sciences. So, what about this general this label in language experience? First of all, I have to tell you that this is not an expression we already find among the classical pragmatists. This is a proposal I suggest in order to radicalize, make a bit more coherent, and expand their approach to language and experience. And it is a pragmatist, a kind of pragmatist proposal, because most of the resources I am making use of are taken from their texts, the texts of the classical pragmatists. So while the idea of a close intertwining of experience and language in the human world had long been clear to me, I first came across this adjective, I mean enlanguaged, in relation to the human form of life, human culture and understanding in Joseph Margoli's work. and particularly in his books, The Arts and the Definition of the Human and Toward the Metaphysic of Culture. In both of these books, he mentioned this adjective and language together with another one that is enculturated, in order to emphasize the point that in the human form of life, biological, natural resources are transformed through what he names, he calls cultural linguistic utterances. So I believe that this notion could be interesting also beyond the pragmatist scholarship, because the dichotomy between experience and language is a traditional, almost a traditional subject in the history of philosophy. Just to mention one name, Schopenhauer, for example, was one of the main supporters of a dichotomic vision of the two. But even in the phenomenological tradition, there are many places, many loci where we can find this kind of dichotomy, especially when considering Husserl's point of view. For Merleau-Ponty, the situation is a bit different, and maybe we can speak about that. We could speak about that later. And another point is that in the current debate in post-cognitive cognitive sciences, there are many efforts. Many efforts are being made in recent years for overcoming a dichotomy they found between, on the one side, so-called lower cognition processes, and on the other side, higher cognition processes. On the one side, what they call no-representational processes, and on the other side, representation-hungry processes, such as language, memory, imagination, considered as opposite to perception and movement. Okay. Le micro n'est pas bon?
Il faut le mettre sur votre...
Ok.
Comme ça, ouais, on va être sûr que ça frotte. Je vais voir ce que ça donne. Là.
Ok. Excusez-moi à tous. Okay. So this is a picture, as you can see, a picture, no, these are many pictures. On the one side you have William James and John Dewey, and on the other side you have Richard Rorty, of course. So according to a traditional account of the story, of the standard account of the story, the main difference between so-called classical pragmatists on the one side and neo-pragmatists on the other side would be represented by a movement, a shift from a primary focus on experience to a primary focus on language. And here in particular you can see William James, who was for sure among the name I quoted the most resistant to understanding language in relation to experience. Even though I've tried to do some work on his principle of psychology, and I think together with William Gavin and particularly Jackman, that there is something interesting also in his philosophy about an alternative view of language that could be very close to experience. In any case, this is a very simplified picture, as for example David Hildebrand clearly explained, but also as in Italy Rosa Calcaterra and in the US Christopher Peril showed. That is, Rorty's thesis should be more finally interpreted. In any case, I do not want to enter the debate, that is the debate on classical pragmatism and neo-pragmatism. What is interesting for me is that the picture of classical pragmatists as thinkers exclusively focusing on experience regarded as the still metaphysical ground of philosophy at the expense of language is not only simplistic, but to me it is indeed false. It is indeed false because the classical pragmatists have developed many interesting insights and arguments with regard to the role of language in the configuration of the specifically human experience. So if by interest for language we understand a kind of focus on language as a quasi-autonomous system composed of words and rules for aggregating, associating them, this could be also true, but their main focus on language was a broadly anthropological focus, considering which could be the role which could be the roles of language in developing the human form of life, both on an ontogenetic and on a phylogenetic level. As you can see, I'm not speaking of language and that's it. I'm speaking about enlanguaged experience. So some preliminary clarification must be added, I think, in order to understand what I mean by enlanguaged experience. Considering the pars destruens of the pragmatist classical pragmatist enterprise, they adopted, at least Dewey and for sure even George Mead, Lorimer, in James there are some ambiguities. In any case, they all shared a basically anti-intellectualistic stance toward experience. Experience should not be understood primarily with reference to cognition. Alternatively, it should be understood with a primary reference to life, and life, organic life in an environment. Another very important point from a pars destruens point of view is their anti-internalism. That is, the idea that experience is not an intrapsychic phenomenon developing inside the interior theater of the mind and separated from the reality of things out there. So given this kind of dualistic picture, it becomes comprehensible why the story of modern philosophy had as a core issue the problem of understanding how the bridge, the gap, could be overcome, and of course one of the first responses was through representation, through considering, by means of considering mental states as representation of outside, of things that are outside in the reality out there. So experience for Dewey is basically a function of life rather than cognition. And this is a quote from Arthur's Experience, where he says the nature of experience is determined by the essential conditions of life. While man is other than bird and beast, he shares basic vital functions with them and has to make the same basal adjustment if he is to continue the process of living. And secondly, experience happens in the environment. It consists, according to Dewey, in the interactions continuously taking place between organisms and their environment, through which organic life is constituted as a part of the same environment. This is a quotation that I think I already presented to you during my first lecture, so I will skip it. In the last few days, I was re-elaborating some of these ideas also for a paper I'm going to present, and I was asking myself if we could speak of the concept of experience, the pragmatist concept of experience as an externalistic conception, and I had some doubt, to be honest, in this sense that if by externalistic we mean that it is not an internalistic conception of experience, this is right. But this idea, the idea that experience is consists in the interactions between organic and environmental resources, does not prevent us to consider that, for example, brain processes, dispositions are part of the interactions. The point is that they refuse to consider these elements, for example, the brain and the nervous system, as the main actor, the main agent of experience itself. Differently, I think that a more adequate characterization of Dewey's concept of experience could be that of that he understood experience as a kind of ecological conception. That is, the environment, features of environment, are constitutive elements in entering into the interaction, as well as organic elements. And this point, the point regarding this broadly ecological conception of experience, will be important for understanding how and why I'm suggesting you to speak about enlanguaged experience and human human experience as enlanguaged. So let's arrive at the first claim. That is, assuming a pragmatist notion of experience, I suggest considering human experience as enlanguaged. What does it mean? This means that human experience is contingently but irreversibly embedded from each person's birth within contexts made up of linguistic practices, as well as more or less meaningful relations that contribute to continuously redefining what happens. In other terms, what I'm going to claim is that there's no space or no phase, or even no phase in human experience that is immune from the kind of enlanguaged, linguistically inhabited environment we are exposed from our first days. This is my first claim regarding enlanguaged experience. And to be a bit more explicit, let's consider the case of the newborn. Very often, newborns are characterized as pre-linguistic beings, but this means looking at their behavior as if their behavior would be defined only through their own kind of action. And of course, a newborn, a very little baby cannot speak. However, in the sense that he cannot pronounce words and put a predicate after a subject. However, the point is that from the very beginning, the newborn is embedded in a linguistically laden environment in which he is gradually entrained through a multiple amount of resources, primarily bodily resources. For example, gestures. Here we have Barbara Formis, who is a specialist in this sense. And gestures are very important means for communicating in the first few days of life. But also the timbre, also the material aspect, the melody, rhythm, movements, and moreover, perception, not only perception and action, but also the neurological development of the child is from the very beginning exposed to a linguistic world where he or she develops. And this point were very soon seen by both Dewey and Mead, as well as by Lorimer. Not to mention William James and his idea of the brain and the nervous system as extremely flexible. There is also, however, a disclaimer to add, that is that this idea that I draw from the pragmatist it does not commit itself to a kind of transcendentalism, but want to emphasize that the advent of language is completely fortuitous, but also irreversible, in the sense that once language appears in the human world, it caused a disruptive effect on previous forms of interaction. So, for example, animal sensibility, what Dewey calls sensitivity, had been completely transformed through the advent of language. For example, by becoming a form of self-sensitivity, and not only of sensitivity of the circumstances, of the situation around the agent. And I think that this idea of a disruptive effect of language on previous forms of interaction could be familiar to the classical pragmatists because of their closeness to people like John Fiske, Chauncey Wright, that from a certain point of view, as for example supported by Andrea Paravicini, we're able to see in advance what Gould and Verba consider to be exaptation, that is, the capacity to use and to co-opt previous organic resources into new for new function, into new forms of interactions. So the other side of the claim regards more emphatically language. That is, I don't want, and I think it should already be clear, I don't want to focus on language as a kind of independent and abstract system. not only because I'm not a linguistic or a philosopher of language, and so I've not those kind of competencies that are requested in order to consider language in that way, but more radically because I'm interested to consider language as we primarily meet it in our world. So enlanguaged experience refers to the fact that human beings do not primarily encounter language in an isolated or pure form, whatever this might mean. For example, the mere logical structure of language, a transparent device for making univocal references, a series of distinct and clear definitions, the product of an innate grammar, and so on. Conversely, we meet language primarily as a part of our conduct as well as of our environment. And here comes again the idea of experience as ecologically configured. It is deeply, language is deeply mixed with other communicative components of our behavior, which could roughly be characterized as multimodal and are continuous with more strictly linguistic aspects. And for example, Adam Kendon, one of the leading figures in the studies on human gestures, underlined that it is very difficult pragmatically, but also in principle, distinguishing in human behaviors what are proto or para-linguistic aspects from properly linguistic aspects. What is outside of language and what is inside of language. Our gestures are the timbre, the rhythm, mere addings, external addings to properly linguistic features, or are they part of linguistic behavior? And so, of course, I do not intend to deny that an exclusive focus on language as an abstract system is important and should be pursued. This is something obvious, of course. The point is, to me, from a pragmatist view, that we should not forget that this kind of object of study, language as an isolated system, an autonomous system, is the product of our primarily behavior that is enlanguaged from the very beginning. So in a nutshell, language is a part of the thick fabric of our experience as well as of the human words. Another way to express the thesis is that language is a feature of the human world. In other words, linguistic practices are both some of the ways in which humans experience their environment and a vital part of the environment that humans experience and pass down through countless generations. So this is for the first part of my lecture today. So, which are the arguments, the claims that we can find among classical pragmatists? While preparing the lecture, I tried to collect them in a list. Let's see if it works. So, first of all, a general claim. The classical pragmatists envisage language as a mode of behavior that plays a crucial role in the shaping of peculiarly human forms of life. That is, they adopted a broadly anthropological stance toward language, considering how it impacts on previous forms of interactions. They abandoned, basically, the idea of language as the merely external cloth of thinking, understood as an essentially mental event. They radically rejected individualism as the standard methodological approach, by regarding shared contexts and participatory situations as the natural human condition, rooted in the strong mutual dependence characterizing human communities from their organic constitution. And of course, here we have some echo of what I explained in the first lecture, that is cultural naturalism, and the idea that culture is grounded in the very condition of human life, human strong immaturity at birth, and human constitutive dependence from the social group to which human life belongs. I have tried to categorize some way or the other some main claims. First of all, the idea of human language as multifunctional. All of these thinkers assumed language to be a very rich, multi-layered and multifunctional phenomenon that supports social ties on mainly qualitative affective grounds, make things and events common, mutually coordinates social behavior on different scales, and operates both analytically and holistically. For example, Dewey strongly stressed the idea that language has a primarily phatic function. In the famous remark he had in the chapter on language when reading Malinowski's essay on the meaning of meaning. When speaking about mutual coordination of social behavior, of course, I remind immediately to Mead and his work on the conversation of verbal gestures as coming from development of previous form of conversation that are mainly ruled through a kind of affective sensitivity towards the other. They highlighted, here comes a further claim, that is that the pragmatists had a very thick idea of language, in the sense that they thought of language not only as a vehicle of meaning or as a way to shape meaning more precisely, but also as something that could be enjoyed for itself. For example, there are some remarks by Frank Lorimer who at a certain point says that maybe language came from festivity, from the capacity of enjoy the sounds and the collective melody arising from our conversations. So they highlighted not only that language is the main means to scaffold reflection and inference, but also that it enters human experience as immediate enjoyment or suffering in relation to circumstances that are either favorable or adverse to human life. And finally, I enlisted the claim on the continuity between sensibility and language. The pragmatist work supports the claim that language and sensibility are not two separate and hierarchically ordered levels of cognition, but are intimately intertwined in human experience. Dewey, Mead, and Lorimer develop an idea of human experience as continuous with other non-human forms of experience, and at the same time as profoundly reorganized by the advent of verbal communication. So the idea of transformation, and later on we will return to this point. They thought that language emerged through the interaction of previous organic forms of intelligence with animals' natural environments that were already social to a greater or lesser extent. And this was a point clearly stated by Frank Lorimer, who, from a certain point of view, criticized and at the same time develop Dewey's arguments on language by supporting the idea that language cannot be seen as the only agent of the transformation. We should also consider a previous form of organic intelligence. And there are passages from Frank Lorimer that clearly seems to anticipate the idea of sense-making supported by the enactivist. Language caused, the advent of language caused on a phylogenetic level, but causes also on an ontogenetic level a deep loop effect and reorganization of previous forms of animal sensibility, cognition, and sociality, giving rise to peculiarly cultural, natural living beings, that are humans. So here is the point about continuity. What kind of continuity are we speaking about? I already touched the point during my first lecture, but I want to renovate the point. That is, here we are not speaking about a kind of linear, cumulative, progressive continuity. That is, the idea that of distinct layer that would be added one on the other, but we are speaking about a kind of circular continuity involving mutual causality, feedback actions, loop effects, and disruption. My idea from, let's say, an historiographical point of view is that Dewey strongly developed this kind of argument by means of his Hegelian heritage and Hegel's idea of dialectic as involving a disruptive effect on previous determinations. But, for example, we find it very, very strongly in Lorimer, who was not a kind of Hegelian guy, and in his case, I think it was connected to his broadly anthropological, linguistic, ethological, psychological interests that are widespread in the book. So here we have a very bad picture, to be honest, of Mead and Dewey, but I couldn't find a better one. I wanted to have a picture of them together. This was. So that's it. Dewey and Mead strongly emphasize that the human mind and selfhood should be considered the exceptional, albeit fortuitous consequences of the advent of language. And I have already said something about that. And here you can see the title of the book by Frank Lorimer. The Growth of Reason is the title, and the subtitle, a long subtitle, is A Study of the Role of Verbal Activity in the Growth of the Structure of the Human Mind. He published this book in 1929, and it is as a PhD dissertation that he held under the supervision of John Dewey. I found the book in John Dewey library with some notes written by Dewey himself. And I think that this was a very important this can be a very important integration of Dewey's chapter on language in experience and nature. There are clear references to the book. Lorimer is an almost neglected figure because he later on went away from philosophy and became a demographer. And significantly to me, he was very interested in phenomena in phenomena connecting cultural and biological aspect. For example, the birth rate in some countries, insofar it is related to cultural, social conditions of life. And in a certain sense, we can say that he practiced the pragmatist maxim. That is, he tried to put into practice what the consequence of his theoretical background. So, to conclude, some important contributions of the classical pragmatists reveal important in emphasizing the significance of aesthetic, qualitative, and affective feature that has played and continue to play a pivotal role in human linguistic practices. This is a kind of more in details clarification of what I have said before. That is, in this light, linguistic practices shows once more that the opposition of sensibility on the one side and language on the other side is artificial, insofar language is considered to me a merely conceptual or referential tool. But this is not true according to the to the classical pragmatists. Dewey profoundly emphasized that linguistic meanings probably emerged out of feelings and out of previous form of sensibility. Frank Lorimer strongly stress the idea that there could be recognized a kind of aesthetic affective tissue of speech preceding the birth of nomination. That is, he developed the idea that nomination is a kind of second step in language development. Basically, we could add through Mead, basically caused by the necessity to organize a kind of language that is not simply attuned to the familiar community, but has also to works for foreign and larger communities. And finally, Mead's account of the genesis of verbal gesture out of conversation of gesture very frequently, but not always, has marginalized the emotional affective dimension of this kind of transformation, but more recently this kind of focus has been made. So I think I can simply mention a couple of new concepts that are circulating in the debate, and that it seems to promising to provide promising points of convergences with pragmatism. That is, I think in 2019, Di Paolo, Cuffari, and Jaeger published this book on linguistic bodies, trying to give a picture of how so-called participatory sense-making through bodies can be reinterpreted in linguistic terms. Then there is this group of people in Denmark who are focusing on language, considering Maturana's legacy in particular, and they are working on the concept of languaging as a kind of primary experience of language that only in a derived way becomes a quasi-autonomous system. And I discovered in Compiègne that there is also a French côté of this kind of scholars, particularly Bottineau, but also Vincenzo Raimondi, who are working on the theme, on the subject with with very good ideas. Another point of convergence is with the idea of niche construction, because there are some scholars like this Chris Sheena, who worked on language considering it to be a kind of biocultural niche. And finally, even if I didn't put a slide on this, there are people like Kiverstein and Rietveld who are working on the connection between ecological psychology and activism, who try to develop this new conceptual means, that is the idea of Enlanguaged affordances. So the whole scene is very vivid, and I think that there could be possible convergences, interesting discussion, and further development. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.